Even though we've known about volcanoes for thousands of years and have tracked their eruptions going back 7,000 years ago, they still hold plenty of secrets. And it turns out what we once thought was one of the most reliable ways to predict volcanic eruptions may not be all that helpful after all. Volcanoes are ranked by how frequently they blow their tops, based on their eruption frequency, shape, and size. And since they're ranked by committee, you can imagine there is some overlap between categories. But in general, volcanoes are considered quiet if they haven't erupted in over 10,000 years, active if they've erupted at least once in the past 10,000 years or recently, and dormant if they haven't erupted in over 200 years but show signs they could erupt again soon. In reality, the difference between these categories isn't just a matter of time. There are other factors that make some volcanoes more dangerous than others. Take Mount Vesuvius, which is considered active because it last erupted in 1944, or Mount Fuji, which hasn't blown its lid since 1707, but has the potential to cause massive devastation should it erupt again. But even though volcanoes can be ranked according to certain characteristics, exactly how you rank them depends on who you ask. And the truth is, none of these rankings can predict when an eruption might happen. Even experts don't know if a volcano will erupt tomorrow or 10,000 years from now. Now take a deep breath. You're probably watching this video because you're worried about an imminent volcanic disaster. In the US, there are more than 160 volcanoes just waiting to blow, and while major eruptions are rare, scientists believe that something big is bound to happen sooner or later. The problem is predicting when. The largest volcano in the contiguous US is in California's Death Valley National Park. It's called the Long Valley Caldera, and it's a supervolcano capable of blowing tons of ash into the air and having global effects on the climate and food supply. Now, it doesn't seem to want to do that anytime soon. While the caldera formed during a large eruption around 76,000 years ago, it hasn't rumbled to life since around 14,000 years ago. And even then, the last few eruptions were pretty small potatoes compared to the big one, so for now, it's considered dormant. Meanwhile, just down the road, the Koso volcanic field hasn't been quite so chill. Over the past 1,000 years, it's had over 60 smaller eruptions, but because the Koso volcanic field isn't a single volcano but rather a cluster of them, it's hard to say if the next eruption will follow the same pattern. Scientists aren't sure what kind of activity to expect from this particular volcanic field, or when the next eruption will take place. This makes it a potentially active system even though it's been quiet for the past century. And these uncertainties extend far beyond California's borders. Take Mount Ibu in Indonesia, which is considered active. It last erupted in 2021, and before that in 2004, with smaller eruptions sprinkled in between. Both eruptions were fairly large, but they looked nothing alike. In 2004, hot lava flowed down the side of the mountain. In 2021, a thick plume of ash rose up into the sky. So far, researchers haven't been able to figure out why two recent eruptions coming from the same source looked so different. And that means they can't really tell what the next eruption will look like either. Scientists used to think that figuring out these differences was as simple as looking at a volcano's history and seeing if there was a pattern. But it's not always that easy. Take Krakatoa, the Indonesian volcano that caused the largest explosion in recorded human history. Before 1883, Krakatoa hadn't done anything too crazy for hundreds of years. But then in 1883 it blew up so violently that the blast was heard 2,000 miles away. Since then, there have been several smaller eruptions, but no sign of another Krakatoa-sized event. Did the big one spend all its energy in 1883, or could it do it again? Well, scientists still don't know. They're getting better at reading the signs, though. For example, we know that earthquakes are often an indicator that a volcano is about to blow. Some of the biggest volcanoes in the world, including Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines and Mount St. Helens in Washington state, had noticeable increases in earthquake activity before they erupted. And even though there are plenty of volcanoes that have had swarms of earthquakes that didn't erupt, it's generally a good idea to pay attention when the rumblings under a volcano get too loud. Unfortunately, not all volcanoes give us the courtesy of a swarm of earthquakes beforehand. Some hint at an eruption by bulging. When magma pushes its way toward the surface, it can swell a volcano like a balloon. For example, in 2014, scientists noticed that Nicaragua's Masaya volcano was inflating. 4 years later, the volcano began erupting almost daily. Of course, just because a volcano is inflating doesn't mean it's about to blow its top. Take Mexico's El Barú volcano, which has been slowly inflating for decades. Maybe it'll erupt. Maybe it won't. We just don't know. Meanwhile, some volcanoes signal an impending eruption by literally letting off steam. When magma heats up groundwater, it creates steam pressure, and some volcanoes release that pressure by making steam. You'd probably recognize a steam eruption if you saw one. Steam isn't usually a sign of anything more serious brewing beneath the surface. Still, even these less obvious signs of an eruption can be hard to spot. Consider Mount Merapi in Indonesia, which is considered active. In 2006, it began emitting more sulfur dioxide gas, which scientists considered a sign that magma was rising. But instead of erupting, the volcano started putting out even more lava flows than usual. Was it trying to give us a cryptic message? It wasn't until 2010 that things got serious. In April of that year, Mount Merapi belched out a plume of ash, and in November it had its biggest eruption in a decade. So even though scientists can study volcanoes and learn a lot about their behavior, it's difficult to tell whether the subtle signs mean a big eruption is on its way. In fact, many volcanoes don't give us any warning at all. Take the 1980 eruption of Mount Helens in Washington state. Overnight, the north side of the volcano collapsed, triggering a massive landslide and pyroclastic flow. Then the volcano erupted, sending a cloud of ash 12 miles into the air. These events caught scientists off guard, which resulted in the deadliest eruption in U.S. history. 5 people lost their lives. It's worth noting that all volcanoes are different and no two will behave exactly the same. So what works as a warning sign for one volcano might not work for another. That's why studying individual volcanoes is so important. Take Mount Rainier, which sits 80 miles south of Seattle. Scientists have spent a lot of time monitoring this volcano. They've learned that it tends to erupt explosively when the magma has a high silica content, which produces stiff lava that doesn't flow very far. On the other hand, when the magma has a low silica content, the resulting lava flows can travel much farther. That information could help emergency planners decide where to focus their resources in the event of an eruption. Unfortunately, we're still not great at predicting eruptions. Most eruptions can't be predicted days or even weeks in advance. Instead, official alerts usually go out only when an eruption is imminent or underway. That's why it's especially important for people living near volcanoes to understand the risk they're taking when they move into an area that's considered active. For example, roughly 20,000 people live within the danger zone of Mount Helens. Should they pack up and move? Probably not. But they should probably be prepared to evacuate quickly. If necessary, even though Mount St. Helens hasn't been very active in recent years, scientists think it's due for another eruption. Because predicting volcanic eruptions is so tricky, it's a good idea to stay up to date on science news from around the world. Thanks for watching this episode. If you want to learn more about volcanoes, check out our video on why some volcanoes are colored green.